Good morning. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody here. For those of you who don't know me, I am Maureen McCarthy. I'm the director of the National Security Forum. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank you to everybody online. It is my pleasure to introduce two stupendous speakers. Professor Xiaoyu Pu is a colleague from UNR. He has been engaged in NSF for many years. I know Ty tapped him for talks many years ago, and a specialist. So when the discussion started going on about China's role in the Panama Canal, I started looking at some articles about China's role in South and Central America. And one of the first articles that came up was Xiaoyu and Margaret's article that they had written in 2022 about China's role in Latin America. And so I got in touch with them and I said, how about an update to that paper? And then tell us how to think about the situation right now. Professor Pu, welcome to NSF and thank you very much for presenting.
Thank you. It's my great honor to speak here. I'm Xiaoyu Pu. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at UNR. I still remember more than 10 years ago, I just arrived in Reno. The first person engaged me with the local community is Dr. Tykop with this National Security Forum. I know National Security Forum, many members have extensive experience in national security, foreign policy, business. So it's such an honor for me to share some thoughts on this topic. And also my great prayer to share the stage with my co-author, Margaret Myers. She's really America's top experts, like one of the 2 or 3 top experts on China-Latin America relationship. So I'm very pleased she agreed to share this stage, even virtually. So before I talk about my topic, let me also have some sort of like a personal note. When we talk about politics or China, that's super sensitive nowadays. It could be very much like polarized, this kind of topic. So I was born and grew up in China, but I have lived in the United States for more than 21 years. So I call Reno my home. But China is my mom's home. America is my home. When we talk about the relationship, oh my God, it's kind of tricky, right? So my approach is always sort of emphasize academic approach, try to be nuanced, try to be as objective as possible. But my observation could also be very much limited. So I will really look forward for your comments. For today's topic, China-Latin America relations, the distribution of labor is that I will focus a little bit about China's thinking and calculations. And my co-author, Margaret, she will provide a lot of empirical evidence about China's practice on the ground in Latin America. So it's hopefully good complementary our presentation. So regarding China's calculation, I will primarily talk about 3 questions. Number 1, China's grad strategy. What is China's grad strategy overall? Before we talk about China's calculation vis-a-vis Latin America. Second is, I will introduce this debate, so-called strategic overstretching problem. What is strategic overstretching? And why is that debate relevant to our understanding of China's strategy vis-a-vis Latin America? The third is implications for China-Latin America relations. I will talk this very briefly. And as I said, Margaret will provide a lot of evidence and empirical data to analyze China-Latin America relations. So regarding China's grad strategy, the number 1 question is this. Does China have a coherent grad strategy to replace the United States as number 1 global power? I think this is widely discussed in policy circles, strategic circle, news media. The dominant narrative seems to be very obvious. Think about the national security strategy, the Trump first term, Biden national security strategy, all emphasize the challenge for China. The dominant narrative emphasizes 2 points. Number 1, China seeks to replace the United States as number 1 leading global power. Number 2, China has a coherent grad strategy to advance its power and status. Think about some popular publications like a Graham Anderson's book about the so-called Thucydides trap, describe the relationship between the rising power and established power is often very conflictual. And also Michael Pillsbury, a former Pentagon official, an expert on China, his book, The 100 Years Marathon, described China has a so-called secret strategy to replace the United States and global power. And also Rashi Doshi, Dr. Doshi was Biden administration's senior director for China and National Security Council. His book, talking about China has this kind of long game to replace US-led global order. My own observation is that this kind of narrative reflects some partial truths. But in the wider academic world, the question is still debated regarding China's foreign policy intentions. But on the other hand, I think this kind of narrative is politically useful as mobilization. I think it's useful to make American people aware China is running fast. China, to some degree, maybe not accurate, is like your neighbor's super kid. I mean, doing all this stuff. I think that kind of narrative is useful to make America aware there is a competitor over there, right? So that's my observation. However, as I said, China's real sort of foreign policy intentions are debated. Really, China want to replace the United States as a new global leader? I'm not sure. Over the years, I have tracked a lot of debates in China, and especially among foreign policy experts, Chinese think tank analysis in China. I don't think they have a very much like a coherent vision regarding China's long-term foreign policy goal. So here's an interesting quote. Deng Xiaoping in 1974, he said, quote, "China is not a superpower, nor will it ever seek to be one. If one day China should change its color, become a superpower, the whole world should oppose it." That's kind of interesting, a narrative in retrospect. But on the other hand, my observation is that whether China seeks to be a superpower is very much contested in China. Even like policymakers, scholars outside of China, we frequently talk about China as a rising superpower, right, to some degree. But a superpower even is the term even a taboo in Chinese official discourse. But on the other hand, I said scholars talk a lot about like different aspects of China's identities, whether China is an emerging superpower, a great power, a regional power, or still a developing country. So many years ago, I published a book primarily talking about so-called China's repositioning. It's called rebranding China. China repositioning itself on the global stage. There are a lot of uncertainty regarding China's intention. And another observation is that when I was a PhD student, I conducted a lot of fieldwork research in China. I interviewed some of the leading experts of foreign policy in China's universities, think tank like Peking University, Tsinghua, and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And these Chinese experts give me all kinds of useful sort of insights. But in the end, in retrospect, I think not these Chinese experts, but some security guards in these universities gave me more interesting insights because I was not a faculty, not a student. So whenever I visited their universities, security guards asked me three questions. Who are you? Where are you going? What are you going to do? In retrospect, I think, oh my God, these three questions exactly summarize three key questions about China's grand strategy debate. One is about China's identity. Is China trying to think itself as a regional power, great power, or superpower, or still a developing country? The identity shape your definition of national interest, and your definition of national interest shape your strategy down the road. But nowadays, I think these three questions here in the United States, I'm a U.S. citizen now. From last year, I became a U.S. citizen. I think these three questions we can ask ourselves. Who are we? Where are we going? What are we going to do? A lot of foreign policy debate, I know, is very polarized in the United States, largely also reflects these three questions about how we think about ourselves, how we think about define our national interest, how we think about our strategy to defend our national interests, all kinds of different questions. I co-authored a paper with my former advisor, and we conceptualized China in terms of long-term strategic goal or strategy, have three choices. Number one, China could be a spoiler, delegitimize the existing order and replace it with something entirely new. Second, China could be a supporter because China has benefited a lot from the current international order. They make big money. They become rich because of the peaceful environment in the current international order, at least this region surrounding China. The third option is China could be a shirker. China could just focus on its own domestic growth while shirking from greater responsibilities. So that's how we conceptualize China's choices. But again, I think these three choices, to some degree, we can ask ourselves, what do we want in the United States foreign policy as well? So then regarding China's greater strategy, conventionally, we think, of course, greater strategy really means the combination of military, political, economic tools a state employs to safeguard its national interests. How you defend your national interests, that's greater strategy. Regarding this particular debate, it's called a strategic overstretching. Originally, it came from a famous book written by Paul Kennedy. He is a British historian now teaching at Yale University, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. So this book attracted a lot of attention among Chinese experts since 1980s, because this book talks about the problem of great powers, the challenges. Number one is different growth rate will change the distribution of power in the system. The second, especially for established power, is that sometimes established power might face the problem of strategic overstretching, in a sense that we might spend too much money and resources worldwide, and the cost of maintaining the system is larger than the benefit. That's called a strategic overstretching problem. China is not an established hegemonic power, not yet. As rising power, very interesting enough is that I also find a lot of Chinese experts, they also pay attention to this problem, whether China also has this sort of strategic overstretching problem as expand its power and influence worldwide. So I published two articles, one with my former UNR PhD student, now a professor at the University of Macau. We track a lot of sort of Chinese debate, focus on these strategic overstretching problem. Then the second is the article with Margaret Myers. We apply this concept, whether China has an overstretching problem in Latin America, like whether China already sort of like all the investment presence in Latin America already too costly for China. We find these Chinese experts, they talk about different dimensions of the debate. One is priority of foreign policy. Should China's foreign policy focus on regional focus in East Asia or global? The other is means, economic, military, and diplomatic. Which tools China should focus? So that's another important. The third is a time horizon, short-term versus long-term. As a rising power, it's pretty natural that they try to expand their influence. They try to expand their power, but there is a question about the speed, how fast China wants to expand its power and influence. If China really try to expand its power and influence in a very fast manner, it's naturally, it will generate all the backlashes. But if China just try to expand its influence incrementally, then the pushback might be more limited. I find it interesting enough that some of the strategic scholars in China, they don't talk about like China should not expand its influence. They talk about how about the speed? How about do we have enough patience? So they talk about the concept called strategic rash advance. In a sense, that if China expands its influence too fast, that will generate a lot of backlashes. And my personal observation is that for a lot of China's regional and global security challenges, China might be able to largely manage those problems, including Taiwan, South China Sea. Like if they try to manage those problems, they probably can still manage those problems peacefully. But if they want to settle those disputes on their turn shortly, that will generate a lot of tensions and even conflict. Another dimension of the debate is about the time horizon. Let me quickly summarize what's so what, right? If these Chinese experts, think tank analysis, they debate about like a strategic overstretching, so what for China and Latin America relationship. In a broader sense, I think China's foreign policy goals overall emphasize three dimensions. Each of these has some implications for Latin America regions. One is security. They try to defend their security. But China's security, I think, primarily focus on regime security, like the security of the political system, not the global security. Second, sovereignty. Regarding sovereignty, why Latin America matters? Because most of countries formally recognize Taiwan still located in Latin America, Central America. So there are still about 7 out of like 11 countries diplomatically formally recognize Taiwan. So China tried to battle against Taiwan's influence in Latin America. The third is economic development, primarily related to trade and BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Many countries like Brazil and others, China has become their #1 trading partner since more than 10 years ago. So that's a very broad economic relationship. Get back to my original question, how about the strategic overstretching debate? What are the implications? So I think China does not yet, given our evidence, we analyze those Chinese writings and publications, does not face a serious problem of overstretching in Latin America. Not yet. But a lot of experts in China, they realize China must be a little bit like sensitive to this kind of China, Latin America, U.S. triangular relationship. So they realize some of U.S. sensitivity regarding China, Latin America relationship. And regarding BRI, the Chinese government has not totally abandoned BRI, but they realize all the challenges, problems, even backlashes. So they are now trying to adjust the implementation of the BRI. So ultimately, many countries joined the BRI in Latin America, and a challenge is how to improve efficiency, accountability. That's a common challenge for both China and Latin America.
Excellent. Thank you. Margaret, I will advance slides for you.
My name is Margaret Myers, as was mentioned. I was at the Inter-American Dialogue, which you can see the logo for on this page, for 15 years, covering the China-Latin America dynamic. Prior to that, I worked at the Department of Defense doing work on China and Latin America, so focusing on different regions, but then concurrently toward the end of my time there. And now I'm at Johns Hopkins University, also looking at China's global outreach as part of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm also thrilled to be presenting alongside Dr. Xiaoyu Pu, who is a top scholar on these issues and has been really definitive in his work on overreach, overstretching, and wide-ranging other issues. What I hope to do in my short presentation is just to kind of give you all a sense of where things stand right now in the China-Latin America dynamic, and for us to use this data, this information, to begin to think about whether overstretching, overreaching is in fact happening, or whether there is a risk that this could happen for China, or that China could begin to think more seriously about this problem in the coming years. I'll talk a little bit about the sort of manifestations of Chinese economic engagement in particular, but I want to note, referencing back to Dr. Pu's presentation, that as we think about all that China is doing and has done in the region really over the past 3 decades, this period of enhanced engagement dates back to the mid-1990s for the Latin American region. There have been efforts among wide-ranging stakeholders, Chinese, Latin American, U.S., and otherwise, to characterize China's engagement in different ways. Sometimes China is characterized as a spoiler, including within certain Latin American countries by Latin American actors, right? Sometimes as a supporter. Many countries in the Caribbean, for example, really are looking to China for climate assistance at this juncture. And China has been very keen to advertise itself as such, right, as a supporter of Latin American development objectives. And then a shirker, I mean, that's another really interesting lens through which to potentially look at some of what China is doing. I will also explain, just as Dr. Pu mentioned, the ways in which the Belt and Road Initiative is shifting. This issue of overstretching and overreaching is one that continues to be debated, right, in the literature, as was mentioned, but also I think will apply even more profoundly to the China-Latin America dynamic in the coming years. So in general, when I talk to audiences and my students about what's happening in the China-Latin America dynamic, I tend to suggest that there are three general trends underway. One is a tapering of overall economic engagement. This runs a bit in counter to what we hear in the media about extensive Chinese engagement everywhere in the world, including in Latin America, and it is indeed extensive, but it has been slowing. Growth has been slowing in Chinese, in total, average economic engagement over time. At the same time, and related to this, is a focusing of Chinese attention on very specific economic sectors in Latin America that are, in most cases, directly related to China's own economic growth objectives and increasingly critical economic growth objectives given the challenges that China is facing at home economically. And then the third trend that we see is localizing of Chinese activity. We used to see a lot of interaction at the state level, leader to leader, but now so much of what's happening commercially, politically, and otherwise is taking place at subnational levels. So whether that's provinces or state leaders of these subnational units or at the cities level through engagement with mayors and others. So in terms of this tapering relationship, we're looking at kind of the three primary mechanisms through which China economically engages the region. That's trade, finance, and investment. If we look at the trade relationship, that is not slowing. It's growing. It's not growing necessarily at the same rate that it has in the past, and it's not necessarily growing as a share of Latin American GDP, but it's growing and continues to underpin the relationship. As you can see here on the top graph, so much of what Latin America is exporting to the region is in the form of extractive goods or agriculture, much less so in manufacturing. It's a very imbalanced relationship in that sense, given that so much of what China is exporting to Latin America is manufactured and increasingly high value added manufacture, everything technology related that one might imagine. You can see here these lithium and copper have been a growing interest of late, and these charts would go even higher since in 2022 on the bottom, but you can see growth over time in terms of the light pink is exports to China of these things, whereas the red is Latin America to other countries. And so you can see China playing a really, really critical role as a market for so much of what Latin America is producing, which creates a certain sort of power dynamic over time necessarily. Where we do see really clear evidence of tapering is in finance and also investment. So very recently we wrote, or just last year, and we tend to do this annually, as a sort of update on Chinese finance to the region. This one was called Feeling the Stones. And we produced this and an accompanying online data set with Boston University. And as you can see in this chart, we made some revisions between our 2023 data, which is in green, and our 2024 data, which is in blue, given the Ecuador's reports to the IMF, which clarified some of the lending arrangements. But regardless of whichever line we use, you can see that over time there has been a dramatic decline in Chinese finance to the region. So we hear a lot about big Chinese loans, we hear a lot about debt trap diplomacy, things of this nature. And indeed, there was a lot of lending to the region, and especially to four very specific countries in recent years. But in the past few years, right, we've really seen barely anything at all in comparison. So we're talking 35 billion around 2010. 2023 was 1.2 billion with two loans that went to Brazil in both cases. A remarkable decline. This is a similar sort of representation of that, although it also shows not just the amount committed in the line, but in the bars, the numbers of actual loans that were issued. So you can see a decline there too. And then in terms of recipients of finance over time, right, Venezuela's been the top by far, representing about half. Then Brazil, Ecuador, and Argentina altogether, these account for approximately 90% of total finance to the region. And each has its own sort of unique debt-related and lending-related story. A big reason that we've seen a decline in finance is because China has moved away from engaging with Venezuela on these terms. As you can see, 2015 was the last lending arrangement with Venezuela. There's still some foreign direct investment in Venezuela, certainly still an effort to maintain equity position in oil fields, but Venezuela no longer being part of the financing equation is a very big contributor to the overall drop. So let's talk a little bit about foreign direct investment. This is where we really see some very interesting tapering. So in addition to kind of a drop in lending, we're seeing in terms of greenfield FDI, so new projects, right, built from the ground up, transmission lines or a new port project or something of that nature. In terms of greenfield investment, we really are seeing a sort of still numbers, but if we look at a 5-year moving average, a sort of leveling off, a tapering of growth in overall investment over time by value. If we're looking at mergers and acquisitions, buying companies that are already there, whether they're, local companies or international companies, this was really what drove so much of Chinese engagement in early years, especially after the global financial crisis in 2008. We saw a boom, right? If you look there, a real boom after 2009 in mergers and acquisitions, especially in energy assets. Here, if we look at a 5-year moving average, we're seeing a real decline in overall economic activity, contributing to this overall tapering phenomenon that I've mentioned. I would say that although we are seeing a decline in the amount, right, the dollar value of investment, especially acquisitions, and a tapering of the dollar value of greenfield foreign direct investment, we are seeing more projects, more actual deals. They just happen to be smaller in value and happen to be focused in some very specific sectors that are directly linked to China's own policy objectives at home as it looks to prioritize certain industries, both domestically and overseas, to achieve greater competitiveness and efficiency to be able to grow at even moderate rates in the coming years. We put out this report just over a year ago now called New Infrastructure. New infrastructure is a term that China has used historically in the past few years to describe the various sectors, really since around the pandemic is when we saw the most reference to this. These are various industries that China has sort of prioritized, again, domestically and internationally, as it looks to upgrade its economy. There are a lot of different definitions of new infrastructure, but there was one put forth by what's called the paper.cn, which is an outlet that comes out of Shanghai. And I like it because it makes it easy to remember. Essentially, it says, let's think about our ABCs when we think about what new infrastructure is. A, artificial intelligence, B, blockchain, D, big data, G is 5G or 6G now, right? In certain cases, industrial internet is I, and so on and so forth. So you get a sense of the level of technology that we're talking about producing and exporting and achieving competitiveness in part of an overall industrial strategy that China's putting forth. So if we're talking about grand strategy, right, there may not be a grand strategy necessarily to supplant the US, or there may very well be, but what there certainly is an industrial policy. And this is having wide-ranging implications. I think also implications in terms of potential overstretching or overreach. And I'll talk about that in a second, the reactions to this and how China's going to navigate it. But in any case, new infrastructure has been a major focus for China over the past few years, and especially certain kinds of new infrastructure. We've seen a big focus internationally, in particular on batteries, on EVs, and on solar panels. I won't go in much depth on this, but this is also related to what Xi Jinping calls new quality productive forces, which has been a sort of term du jour, at least, du jour over the past few years, so, and prior to that, to some degree, right? But the idea here is to transform the economy, seize the opportunity, intensify innovation, cultivate and grow emerging industries, plan ahead for new industries, really modernize the industrial system. So this is the focus at a moment when China can no longer depend on the real estate sector, property sales for the sort of growth that it was able to achieve in previous years. So how does this manifest in the Latin American context? Well, in Latin America, we don't see evidence of all of the new infrastructure necessarily in terms of trade or investment. Some of it, certainly. And we see the most sort of activity in sectors that are mentioned here, the industries, electric vehicles, high-end manufacturing, that's largely a Mexico story and a Brazil story, ICT, information communications technology, renewable energy in its various forms, and urban infrastructure. That's like rail, high-speed rail or metro that may run through certain cities. What you see here is a growth over time. So this is a representation of the extent to which these new infrastructure industries factor in China's overall investment. And what you see is sort of growth over time, more representation of these industries, whether we consider the value of these transactions or the number of actual deals. And largely, this is an ICT story, as you can see, given the amount of gold that you're seeing in this chart. This is just a breakdown of the ICT numbers, and you'll see that over time we've seen more of a diversification in this industry, away from equipment, looking at handsets and other sort of more rudimentary equipment early on, to now really everything you can imagine, devices, equipment certainly, but fintech and other services, connectivity services, right? All kinds of other services related to actually dealing with customers, computing and data services, data centers. This is all part of the story now too. This is a representation by country. You can see that we see activity really everywhere in the ICT space. The green in Nicaragua there is related to a satellite project that was conducted by the same person who had interest in building the dam in Nicaragua a number of years ago. Energy is another area. Green energy transition has been a big focus globally for China as it looks to export essentially excess capacity in solar and wind production. And so you can see over time a really pretty dramatic shift away from traditional oil and gas investment to renewable investment, solar parks. We also include in dams as part of the story. If we're looking at trade, China is still heavily focused in traditional energy sources. Lots of trade in oil and gas and coal and other things coming as a result of investment in those sectors in previous years. So, of course, if we're going to talk about high-end technologies and ICT and other services and production and new energy and EVs, we have to talk about critical minerals. And Latin America has become globally, right, for everybody, but for China too, a critical supplier of these things. It is a lithium story, absolutely, right? If you look at the lithium triangle there, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, but it's also an other minerals story, right? Niobium is a big part of this equation in Brazil. Gold has become more and more important to Chinese investors as they look to hedge against the US dollar. So, and this is not just a China phenomenon, but a lot of countries are investing in gold for that purpose. And then copper too, we're seeing expansion of investment in copper in Peru. The top recipients of Chinese foreign direct investment are by far Brazil, and then Peru, Mexico, and others. We've broken this down by different kinds of sectors, not necessarily new infrastructure, but you can see new infrastructure, renewable energies, utilities are part of new infrastructure, ICT playing a prominent role in this equation as well. Utilities is the kind of darker light blue. And so, Chile had a huge deal just a couple years ago in utilities in Brazil. That's a very big part of its story. Peru, Chinese companies own all of Lima's electricity transmission capacity and related generation. This slide, I think, is really important for us to understand in the context of this broader discussion about overreach. I say that because, as you can see here, there have been some really interesting shifts over time in those countries where China is focusing its attention. In part because I think there is a recognition over time that as China has fewer resources to bring to bear, as it grapples with its own economic challenges at home, as it grapples with a global BRI and wide-ranging investments and other obligations that have been made globally, as it grapples with a lot of projects that have gone wrong and dealing with those, their commercial effects, their reputational effects, that there's been a need, at least, for some change in strategy, whether at the company level or more broadly. And this, to me, is reflected largely in this chart, where you see several years ago more of a focus on those countries where China was able to establish ties because ties were of interest to the countries they were approaching. 2003 to 2007, these were the early years of Chinese engagement. China didn't have a lot of opportunities. It was looking to establish a footprint. It was hard to do. And so some countries welcomed China with open arms, especially those who couldn't access international credit markets, like Ecuador at the time, and a handful of others. Brazil, too, for political reasons, has been a steadfast partner, and also because China has seen Brazil as a critical market and a large market for export and a good place to invest. But what's notable is Chile. So you've got nothing Chile in the first phase. Chile really not factoring also in the second phase. It's number 6 from 2013 to 2017, but then it jumps to number 1. And that to me is very interesting, and also it's indicative of local policy in Chile, but also of a rethinking, a recalibration on the part of Chinese companies, the Ministry of Commerce, others, as they think about how to operationalize the BRI in a way that reduces overall risk while achieving critical economic objectives for China, including the exportation of wide-ranging goods and services. So I think we'll continue to see largely this trend play out in the coming years, in addition to engagement in other countries. But those with higher credit ratings, those that have markets that can absorb these technologies, that have plans and procedures in place to operationalize them, those are going to be the recipients looking ahead. I can talk about Mexico later. Certainly, the Mexico story is hugely complex. We're doing more analysis on this, but we've seen a lot of investment in Mexico of late, especially in high-end manufacturing. That's been a story we've all heard a lot about, and I can talk about our most recent findings there. Should anyone be interested, this is a new tool that we're putting together that visualizes Chinese investment by sector, country, year, type. So far, we're just going across the South America, so we've built out nearly all of South America at this point. It also lists the investments and any related resources, case studies in different languages that could be helpful to researchers or others that are looking to understand what's happening in certain sectors. The other thing that's happening is a localization. This is risk avoidance. When you're dealing with national governments and you have wide political swings in some of these countries from year to year, one way to get around that is to deal more with localities, to strike deals with localities, especially if we're talking about safe cities, smart cities technologies, and other technologies that are applied at the local level. This is just one example from Jujuy province in Argentina. Over the course of 5 years, and a lot of back and forth between Jujuy officials and Chinese officials and other stakeholders and representatives, the two negotiated a surveillance project across the entirety of the province, the largest Cauchari, which is the largest solar park in all of South America, a lot of lithium cooperation, and then a big data center development, which was done in collaboration with a province in China, a sister province of Jujuy. So a lot happening at the local level too, which is critical to understand as we look to see how China's approaching things, what the strategy might be, and whether any of this is related to this notion of overstretching and overreaching and having to deal with that in a more expansive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating presentations. I've got a bunch of questions here. I'm going to try and get them organized. How significant is the number of Chinese nationals living and working in Latin America? And that's probably to Margaret.
Gosh, I don't have any numbers on that, but it is, I mean, there are significant communities. There are, of course, long-standing overseas Chinese communities, right, that have been there for decades or over a century in certain cases and have massive contributions to the countries and where they are based. There are also more recent arrivals, many of which are there temporarily to work on projects, others which stay. In other cases, there are efforts to migrate to Latin America to then migrate north as part of a sort of migration path to the United States or elsewhere. In other cases, we are seeing some really interesting evidence of passport sales, especially in the Caribbean and other places. So, I mean, there are a lot of different avenues and mechanisms and motivations for engaging. I don't have the numbers, but certainly there are large communities and communities that have come at different moments for different reasons and are contributing in different ways.
Excellent. With China's expanding naval presence, as seen off Latin America, can you talk specifically, and this could be to either of you, about the engagement in the Panama Canal? What are they doing there? How often are there naval vessels crossing the Panama Canal? From China's perspective, does the Panama Canal matter?
My own understanding is China's primary security concern is regime security. In that sense, I think China's military presence in Latin America is very limited. And a lot of so-called security cooperation focus on like police or other sort of stuff. I think Margaret might give a little bit more.
Whether this is important to China, I think is an important question. We certainly know that it's of concern to the United States and especially this administration. China, interestingly, has had a focus on Panama for many, many decades and can really only be explained by an interest in the canal as a hub regionally, but also as a critical transport hub to export export and import all of the things that are absolutely fundamental and critical to China. Over time, we've seen considerable interest in investing. When Panama cut ties with Taiwan in 2017 and established them with mainland China, it negotiated 16 deals. A number of those deals have been suspended because of corruption and other problems related to I don't know which side, but nevertheless. A few have made progress. The bridge over the canal, for instance, there's a port facility, a cruise ship terminal that was developed, and a number of other things. Of course, whether China would ever do anything to limit traffic or to exercise whatever leverage these two ports on either side of the canal may have is purely hypothetical. But nevertheless, this is where the concerns lie.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Margaret. You spoke a lot about new investments that were being made and the new focus of the investments. How much of the old investments are still holding? So you said they had made huge investments in oil and gas and agriculture and engagement with Brazil. Is that still going on and then the new investments are building on that? Or are the new investments replacing old investments?
And if you look at the stock of overall investment, the investment that's made over time, it's really quite large, right? It's growing quite large. And a lot of those initial investments hold equity in those sectors and those industries. I would also say that, so traditional investments might be things like agriculture, processing facilities, things like that. Infrastructure, has been a big part of the China story. And oil and gas investment in various parts of the region, equity stakes in certain fields and things like that. Those still hold. Some of these investments have been offloaded. There are some agricultural companies that were acquired. Nidera, for example, a number of years ago, it was sold again. And so you do see some movement. What we're seeing now, it's a mix still, right? And we're still seeing a lot of investment in these traditional areas. At the same time, we're seeing more of the total dedicated to these sort of higher tech, new infrastructure related deals, which are largely an effort to help to export more in the way of goods. And Latin America is a fundamental market for that.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, Xiaoyu, I'm going to challenge you here. So you have to put on your U.S. hat with your China history eyes. Okay, so we just heard that the Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America is shifting, and we heard about tapering and focusing and localizing. If you can look through both of your eyes at the same time, what does that compel the United States to do? And how would China view our response to what they're redoing in Latin America right now? So from a U.S. perspective, but then what will China think about what we're doing there?
Let me first from brief reflection about how U.S. Should or could respond. Then I talk about how China, right? Regarding U.S., I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think it's useful to assume China is like our neighbor's super kid. They are doing a lot of things in Latin America. So if the United States, here we think about how to compete, I think it's very important to think about in a more creative way. I think it's wrong to think about we here in the United States, we need to compete exactly the same way as China does. The United States and China have different advantages and disadvantages. So we cannot really compete like dollar versus dollar. That's not the way. I think the U.S., we need to think about our like industrial advantages in terms of finance, rule of law. That's kind of like a services, rather than we think about, oh, China built a factory in Brazil. We built the same factory in Brazil. I think that's the wrong way to think about how we compete. We need to think about in sort of a symmetrical way. So that's number one. Regarding how China think U.S. reaction, of course, officially, we can see some of like the Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson, their response typically that the United States overreact, think too much. But as I said, our paper, we analyze Chinese think tank analysis, China's scholars on Latin America region. They are aware of America sensitivity. So they advise the Chinese government that China need to be a little bit careful in terms of like how China pursue its own interest and also think about how the United States might potentially react.
Excellent. Thank you. Somebody asked, given current changes in the federal workforce, is there a possible trend of hiring highly educated Americans by China to further China's tech development? And the answer is yes. I had a colleague who had several USAID projects. When those USAID projects were curtailed, 4 of his employees were made offers by Chinese firms within the first 24 hours. So I'm going to let you end with one question for each of you. Close your eyes and think ahead, let's say 5 years, to trends that could be coming to play, both from China's perspective in Latin America, but also the US response. So, Margaret, I'll let you go first, and Xiaoyu, I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to think a week ahead, but I'll give it a shot. Naturally, things are changing in the China-Latin America dynamic. It's maturing, and that means maturing on both sides. Not only do we see these sort of shifts in the way that China's engaging economically, but we also see changes in views of China. There have been projects that have gone wrong that have affected the levels of interest in engaging with China on certain issues, or an interest in doing so much more effectively and with the interests of local communities and countries represented more effectively. China's changing its views, right? As I mentioned, it's looking to reduce risk. Latin America is far away. It's had some problems, Venezuela being one of them. So the way it's engaging is changing. There's more arbitration, there's more litigation, there's more standing up for deals that are being impacted. And so all of this needs to be understood. And it's reflective of a long time now that the two regions have been engaging far more extensively. I think this could create more opportunity for the US to demonstrate its capacity to do capacity building exercises, to recommend things like investment review processes that would help address some of these issues that Latin American countries are coming to realize might be of use. There's an inverse relationship between views of China and views of the US in Latin America. When the US is viewed positively, then China is viewed negatively and vice versa. So much of whether we are able to communicate these things and communicate them effectively will depend on views of the US, number one, but also our engagement. And I'm hoping that we're not doing China's job for China by pulling back from the region in really fundamental, and other regions too, right, in really fundamental ways in a moment when really more engagement might achieve far more to strengthen the overall US position in the region.
Thank you. Xiaoyu.
Yeah, so I just have two very brief comments. I think nowadays a frequent question is like, if the United States reposition itself on the global stage, as I mentioned, this kind of like repositioning, how we think about who we are, where we are going, is that create a huge vacuum for China? China might take some opportunities, but a little bit cautious in a sense that China has its own problems, its own limitations. The United States also have our own advantages as well. So don't assume like, okay, when the United States rethink its power, interest, and the role on the global stage, that's always like China automatically can fill all these vacuum. I don't think so, because China has its own limitations. That's also could be applicable in terms of China-Latin America relations. I think one useful assumption to assume is both the United States and China, very strong and large economies, both will have a very significant role on the global stage. We probably will continue to compete. The relationship, even very competitive, does not have to be always a zero-sum game. I think we need to think in a maybe more nuanced way.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for a very interesting presentation. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next program. We'll be pulling this thread. Obviously, China was too big a topic to cover all at once, so we're doing deep dives in particular areas. Thank you very much, and everybody be safe.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret.
Goodbye.